November 1944. The wind came early that year, a knife-edged breath slipping through the barbed wire at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The sky was pale and endless, its color drained like the faces of the women huddled in their thin gray coats. 37 of them, German female prisoners, taken from shattered units in France, stood in a frozen silence that morning. Behind their eyes lingered the same thought. This is where we die. They had been told the stories long before capture. The American camps, their officers had warned, were wild places ruled by cowboys and revenge. The enemy would starve them, freeze them, make them dig until their fingers cracked and their lungs burned. They would be punished for every bomb that fell on London, every German flag that once waved over Europe. And so, as the train that brought them north slowed beside the white barracks of Camp McCoy, they saw ghosts in every pine and executioners behind every smile. The guards who met them looked impossibly tall, men in wool coats with eyes cold as the iron sky. Some of the women whispered prayers, others clenched their teeth. Among them was Liesel Hartmann, a nurse from Hamburg who had joined the auxiliaries at 19, believing it was her duty. Her father had written her one line before she was sent to the Western Front. "Remember who you are. The world will not forgive you." That sentence clung to her like frost. As they stepped off the rail cars, the snowflakes began to fall. Light at first, then heavier, each one melting into the thin fabric of their uniforms. Their boots were worn, their hands ungloved. Some limped from frostbite already setting in. The camp commandant, a middle-aged officer with a stiff gait, greeted them with words they didn't understand. A translator followed, his accent sharp, but his tone oddly formal. "You are prisoners of war. You will work. You will follow orders. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." That phrase meant nothing to them. Geneva Convention was a rumor, a word wrapped in propaganda. Back home, they'd been taught that Americans only use such words to sound civilized, that in truth, they were no better than beasts. Liesel looked at the translator's lips moving and thought, "He is lying to keep us calm." The barracks were wooden shells, bare and drafty, their walls thin enough that the wind sang through them. Straw mattresses, metal stoves without fire, and a single bucket for washing. When night fell, the cold moved through every board. The women slept in layers of thin fabric, pressed close together for warmth, listening to the creak of pine outside. Some cried softly, others whispered songs from home. Outside, floodlights swept across the wire. In the shadows, they thought they saw the silhouettes of cowboys. Wide hats, rifles, men who would whip them if they stepped out of line. That night, Liesel dreamed of her younger brother on the Eastern Front, frozen to death in the snow near Minsk, and woke with tears frozen on her cheeks. Days turned into a gray rhythm. They scrubbed barracks, shoveled snow, peeled potatoes. The guards watched but did not strike. That puzzled them. No one shouted insults, no one spat. They were given soup that was thin but hot, and bread that was coarse but fresh. The women whispered to one another, "It's only for now. They'll turn cruel when the real winter comes." Then the real winter did come. By mid-November, the temperature dropped below zero. The air itself seemed to bite. The women's breath turned white, their fingers cracked, their hair stiffened into icicles as they carried buckets from the kitchen to the stables. Every night they expected a punishment detail, a death from exposure. Yet what came instead was silence and the distant hum of engines. One dawn, the commandant gathered them near the flagpole. The wind tore at his cap, and his voice had to fight the cold to reach them. The translator stepped forward again. "The camp will begin winterization procedures. You will receive additional clothing, improved barracks, and heating. For a moment, the words did not make sense. Liesel blinked. Winterization. Was it a euphemism for execution or relocation? The women looked at one another in terror. One whispered, "It's a trick. They'll march us into the woods." Another said, "No, they want to make us dig trenches until we die." That night, fear hung in the air like smoke. No one slept. Then, before dawn, trucks rolled into the camp. From them, American soldiers unloaded boxes, not of ammunition or chains, but blankets, coats, boots, soap, wooden crates stamped U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. The guards lined them up in front of the women, who stood trembling in disbelief. One sergeant, his breath clouding in the morning air, gestured for them to come forward. He held up a wool coat, thick, lined, still warm from the depot. When no one moved, he sighed and gently draped it over the shoulders of the nearest woman, an older prisoner whose fingers were purple with frost. She flinched, then froze, then began to sob. The rest followed in silence. Gloves were handed out. New boots replaced torn shoes. A nurse among the Americans, her insignia small but unmistakable, showed them how to use the soap properly in the wash buckets. "Hot water soon?" she said. The German women didn't understand her words, but they understood the tone. It wasn't command, it was care. That evening, as they stood by the barrack stove for the first time, with real heat filling the room, Liesel touched the wool of her new coat and whispered to herself, "They lied to us." The words came out soft, almost sacred. The others nodded. In the flicker of lamplight, their faces seemed less gray, more human again. And outside, the snow continued to fall. Silent and endless, not as a threat, but as a veil over a world beginning to thaw. That single whisper from Liesel did not vanish into the night. It hovered in the wooden beams of the barracks, settling between bunks like dust. The others didn't argue. No one tried to push it away. For the first time since capture, silence wasn't made of fear. It was made of thought. When the guards came the next morning, they came with more than boots and coats. They came with a word none of the women expected to hear again. Showers. The interpreter stood stiffly at attention beside the commandant. The prisoners gathered in the yard, breath rising in thin white plumes, eyes hollow. Some expected humiliation. Others feared deception, a darker memory from the Eastern Front, where shower could mean death. But the voice translated steadily, formally, without menace. "You will be taken in small groups for bathing. Soap and towels have been provided." Liesel could hardly breathe. Hot water? Soap? She was led in the second group. The building stood just off the main row of barracks. Brick walls, a tin chimney that let out small puffs of gray steam. Inside, it was humid. A shock of warmth hit her face. She blinked, and her eyes welled with tears she didn't understand. There were tiled floors, wooden benches, a wall of hooks where she was told to hang her coat. No one shouted, no one watched. She undressed with trembling fingers. Her body had grown thin, her ribs sharp against skin, marred by weeks of cold and labor. As she stepped into the shower room, a plain tile chamber with simple spouts overhead, she reached up to turn the valve. And then it happened. The first hiss of water, then a gush, hot, steaming, real. It struck her shoulders, her neck, her back, and she gasped as if something holy had descended from the sky. Around her, the other women let out soft cries. One fell to her knees, clutching her chest as though she'd been shot, but it wasn't pain. It was the sudden absence of suffering. That kind of relief can break a person. The soap they were given came in small brown bars, stamped U.S. Army. It smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. Strange. Foreign. Liesel lathered it into her skin with clumsy hands, unsure of the ritual. She remembered how her mother used to scold her for leaving soap rings in the tub. What would she think now, Liesel wondered, if she saw her daughter standing naked in a place like this? Scrubbing away the war. They dried in silence. The towels were rough, but real. Clean. A nurse came by, an American, and handed out combs and fresh undergarments. She didn't speak, just smiled faintly and moved on. Outside, the snow had softened. The wind no longer cut as deep. But the strangest warmth was not from the fire or the water. It was the way their bodies felt afterward. Light. Almost human. In the days that followed, more changes came. A shipment of used clothing arrived. Not uniforms, civilian garments in strange colors and shapes. Skirts, heavy coats, scarves, even underthings made of soft cotton. Most were too big, some patched, some perfumed. One woman wept when she realized the coat she'd been given still had a small, embroidered flower on the collar. A gift from a mother to a daughter, now passed to a prisoner. They lined up to receive the clothes in the mess hall, one by one, as an American woman with a clipboard checked their names and sizes. There was no laughter, no mockery, just a strange, quiet professionalism. The German women stood awkwardly in their new outfits, uncertain whether to feel shame or gratitude. "Why?" one finally asked in broken English. The guard shrugged. "Winter's here," he said. "Nobody needs to freeze." In the barracks that night, no one sang. No one told old jokes. Instead, they touched the fabric of their sleeves, brushed fingers through combed hair, and stared at the steam rising from tin mugs of tea. And then, slowly, the conversations began to change. They no longer asked, "When will they kill us?" but "Who sent those clothes?" They no longer feared when the beatings would come, but wondered how many women had stood in those coats before them, and where they were now. Some began to write letters, not to plead for release, but to tell the truth. That they had been captured, that they were alive, that they had been given soap. Liesel sat one night beside the stove, her coat wrapped tightly around her, and stared at the flame. It flickered like the candle her father used to light at Christmas. She remembered how he used to say that fire was not just destruction. It could also be warmth. It could bring people back from the edge of winter. She whispered aloud, "They lied to us." This time, it wasn't about the enemy. It was about the truth they were beginning to see for themselves. That the world wasn't made of monsters and cowboys, but of people. People who might still have kindness buried beneath the rubble. The war outside the fences raged on. But within the wire, something had shifted. The women no longer stood as prisoners of vengeance. They stood as witnesses to something else, something they didn't yet have a word for. The word they searched for was not in any German dictionary, not in the books they read as girls, not in the slogans painted on barrack walls back home. But it stirred now, quietly like the flame in the stove, flickering between hope and shame. At Camp McCoy, the snow deepened. Days passed beneath a sky that looked like ash. And for the 37 women, former auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, secretaries, something even heavier than winter hung around them now. Memory. The daily routines continued. They cleaned kitchens, mended fences, sorted laundry. The Americans watched from a distance, rifles slung casually over shoulders, but with less tension than before. There were no shouts, no dogs. Sometimes, if a woman tripped or dropped a bucket, a guard would even help her up. That simple gesture unsettled them more than the cold ever had. One afternoon, as wind shook the pine trees outside the compound, Liesel was given a pencil and a single sheet of lined paper. "Write home?" the translator had said. "Letters are permitted." The word stunned her. She hadn't held a pencil since her capture, hadn't written to her mother since the ambulance train was bombed in Normandy. Her fingers trembled as she took it. She sat on her bunk for hours. The paper stared back, clean, expectant. But what could she say? "Dear Mother, I am not dead. I am not in chains. I am not beaten. They gave us soap and warm coats, and they call us by name." She tried again. "Dear Mother, we were told they would torture us. But today, an American soldier lit the stove before we even woke up." Again she crossed it out. The truth was too heavy, and yet too light. How do you explain mercy to someone still living under war? How do you write of kindness when your country is still killing theirs? In the bunk across from her, Anke, a girl no older than 18 with frostbitten cheeks and hair like pale corn, scribbled furiously. Her pencil moved like it had waited too long. Anke had been a typist at a Luftwaffe field HQ. She barely spoke. But that night, she folded her paper into thirds with shaking hands and asked if someone could check the spelling. "I want my little sister to read it properly," she whispered. "She thinks I'm in Siberia." Others followed. Letters flowed like water through a cracked dam. Some were defiant, declarations of survival. Others were raw, confessions of doubt, of fear, of confusion. A few, like Liesel's, remained unfinished. They asked the translator where the letters would go. He replied, "Through Geneva, then to the Red Cross. They'll do their best." Do their best. The phrase felt like a promise from another world. And yet, even as ink dried, not every heart thawed. There were whispers. Quiet voices in the corners of the barracks. Women who muttered, "It's a trick. They're softening us." One named Greta, who had been a camp guard herself before capture, scoffed at the clothing, the tea, the fire. "You think this makes them noble?" she hissed. "They are still the enemy." But fewer listened now. Even the guards noticed. One morning, a corporal delivering bread blinked in surprise when a prisoner, Ilse, a seamstress from Munich, said, "Thank you," in English. He paused, nodded once, moved on. That same week, something strange happened. The women were assigned to clean the chapel. A small wooden building with a cross carved into the door, standing at the far end of the compound. No one spoke as they entered. Dust clung to the benches. The air smelled of old books and pine polish. At the front, above the pulpit, hung a painting, not of Christ, but of a valley at dawn, light-piercing mist, trees bending under morning frost. It wasn't German, but it was beautiful. As they swept and scrubbed, the silence thickened into reverence. Liesel paused at the pews, running her fingers along the worn wood. She imagined American soldiers sitting here before shipping out, praying for safety or forgiveness or home. Had any of them knelt here before bombing her city? Before capturing her friends? The thought should have made her furious. Instead, it made her ache. After they finished, Anke sat on one of the benches, her eyes distant. "It smells like the church in our village," she said. "After my brother died, I used to go there just to be warm, just to be somewhere with light." No one answered, but no one left either. Later that evening, a chaplain came by the barracks, not to preach, not to convert, just to talk. He spoke slowly through the translator about winter storms and homesick soldiers, about how war turned everyone into exiles. He looked at the women not as enemies, but as people who had seen too much. Before leaving, he handed out tiny Christmas cards printed by the U.S. Army, each with a hand-painted winter scene. Pine trees, candles, a cottage covered in snow. On the inside, in careful type, was a single line. Peace on earth, even now. Some of the women wept. Others folded the cards into their pockets without a word. That night, no one spoke of cowboys. No one dreamed of fire squads. They stared at the cards, the chapel, the letters, and realized something unbearable. Their world had lied to them. But now, they had to choose what to do with the truth. The truth was not a wall that fell all at once. It cracked, slowly. It crumbled, flake by flake, like the frost peeling off the barracks window at sunrise. Each day at Camp McCoy chipped away another piece. By late November, the women no longer huddled in silence during work details. They spoke softly to one another, not about escape, not about survival, but about the strange warmth growing inside them, wordless and new. It wasn't friendship, not yet. But it was something that lived in the space between silence and trust. The guards noticed it too. One morning, an American private, tall, red-haired, barely more than a boy, dropped a tin box of nails while helping repair the laundry shed. The clang echoed across the yard. Before he could bend down, two of the German prisoners, Marta, a former factory forewoman, and Ilse, a schoolteacher from Bremen, stooped beside him and gathered them up. No one spoke. The three of them worked in silence. But when the last nail was returned, the boy said, almost shyly, "Danke." Ilse smiled. It was small. It was real. That evening, the guards' boots no longer rang so harshly on the ground. Some even lingered at the edge of the mess hall, where the German women now sang lullabies from home. The kind meant for children, not soldiers. Songs without hate. Songs their mothers once whispered by firelight. And the Americans listened, without laughing. But the changes weren't just in sound. There were fewer inspections now. Fewer orders barked. In their place came requests, delivered calmly, sometimes even with pleas. When a pipe burst in the kitchen, one guard handed tools to Greta, the skeptic, and asked if she could help. She hesitated, then fixed it in 10 minutes. "You're a mechanic?" the translator asked. "Was," she muttered. "Before I wore a uniform." He didn't comment, just nodded. A week later, Greta received a pair of wool-lined work gloves, heavier, warmer, and clearly American issue. No one said who sent them. She didn't ask. It was these small exchanges, quiet and unnoticed by the outside world, that began to undo years of indoctrination. Because they weren't grand gestures. They weren't propaganda. They were ordinary. And that, somehow, made them more powerful. The greatest shift came not in the mess hall or chapel, but in the laundry room. It was there, beneath steam pipes and rows of drying linen, that the barrier between captor and prisoner buckled. Not with speeches, not with tears, but with shirts. American and German garments alike were now washed by the prisoners, and sorted together by size, not flag. At first, it was merely practical. But then came the day Liesel unfolded a button-down shirt with a name stitched into the collar. Connolly. It smelled faintly of tobacco and pine soap. She recognized the name. One of the guards. Older. Kind-eyed. He'd once nodded to her when she offered to sweep the mess hall without being told. She stared at the shirt, hands trembling. Should she fold it respectfully? Should she bury it under the pile? Instead, she did something absurd. She ran her fingers along the collar, smoothing the fabric. She pressed the crease carefully, like she used to for her father's best Sunday shirt. And when she was done, she set it gently aside, as if returning something borrowed, not stolen. Word spread. Soon, other women were doing the same, folding with care, treating the shirts not as uniforms, but as belongings. The enemy was no longer a faceless idea. He had sleeves and wear marks and stitched names from Kansas or Ohio. Anka, with her quiet gaze, once whispered, "They have mothers too, don't they?" No one answered. No one had to. But the transformation wasn't without resistance. One morning, the women discovered someone had scrawled across the wall of Barrack 7 in charcoal, "Vergesst nicht, sie sind Feind." Do not forget, they are the enemy. The words burned like frostbite. Liesel stood before them for a long time. Then she took a rag, dipped it in lye, and began to scrub. Others joined her. The words faded, but not without leaving a mark on the wood. It was a reminder that the war was not over, that across the ocean, bombs still fell, that sons still died, that some wounds bled long after the shooting stopped. But here, in this fenced world of snow and pine, the enemy had a face, and sometimes it smiled. That night, when mail was delivered, Anka received a reply from home. The Red Cross had done its job. Her sister was alive. Her village still stood. And the letter, trembling, ink blotted, ended with 4 words she hadn't dared dream of. "I'm proud of you." She read it aloud once, then folded it into her blouse and sat quietly by the stove. Outside, the wind picked up again. But it was softer now. Less like a blade, more like breath. The distance between nations remained. But between hearts, it was shrinking. And then the Cowboys arrived, not with guns, not with horses, but with aprons, laughter, and a smell none of the women could name. Something warm, smoky, alive. It happened in early December. Snow had blanketed Camp McCoy in white silence, so thick that even footsteps were muffled. The barracks' roofs sagged beneath the weight. Smoke curled from chimneys like the breath of the forest itself. And then came the surprise. A new rotation of American troops had arrived. Texans. Their accents were thick like syrup. Their boots loud. They called each other Buddy and Hoss. To the German women who had grown up on stories of American cowboys, wild men with whips and 6-shooters, these new soldiers might as well have been ghosts stepping out of legend. When the women were called to help in the camp's central kitchen that morning, there was tension. No one said it, but the air was tight. These were the ones we were told to fear, Liesel thought. The Western devils. The ones who ride into villages and burn them for sport. But the man stirring the soup pot just smiled, pushed his hat back, and said, "Y'all ever peel taters?" The translator blinked. "He means, do you know how to peel potatoes?" A few of the women nodded. Ilsa stepped forward. So did Marta. Then the rest. The work was simple. Steam rose from boiling pots. Knives clinked on metal basins. And slowly, the tension eased, not through words, but through rhythm. Scrape, slice, drop. The universal language of the hungry. One of the Texans, a broad-shouldered corporal named Billy, offered a woman a spoonful of broth to taste. She recoiled, uncertain. He sipped it first, then held it out again. "Try. Need salt." She took it, hesitated, then tasted. It was good. Better than anything she'd eaten since capture. Word spread. The Cowboys weren't cruel. They could cook. And more than that, they talked. Not at, but to the women. Simple things. "Where are you from? What did you do before the war? Do y'all get snow like this in Germany?" Sometimes the translator didn't even need to repeat it. A gesture, a laugh, a look. It was enough. Ilsa found herself explaining how her mother used to make bread with caraway seeds. The Texan next to her nodded and said, "My grandma made cornbread. Ain't the same, but it fills the belly." For a moment, they were not soldier and prisoner. They were just 2 children, far from home, remembering food in their mother's kitchens. And then came the moment none of them forgot. It was Anka, quiet, watchful Anka, who stood by the stove and inhaled deeply. She closed her eyes. "Speck," she said. "That's bacon." The American cook grinned. "You know your smells." She nodded slowly. "My father kept pigs before the war." The cook paused, then reached into his apron and pulled out a strip, crisped, greasy, hot. He offered it to her with 2 fingers, like passing a secret. Anka took it with trembling hands. She didn't eat, not right away. She just looked at it. And then, with eyes wide, she whispered, "They told us you would never feed us meat." The room went quiet. Billy the corporal leaned on the counter. "Well," he said softly, "we ain't who you think we are." That night, the women talked in hushed tones around the stove. "They are just like us," Ilse murmured. "They are nothing like what we were told," Greta admitted, her voice flat. But it was Liesel who spoke the truth no one dared name. "They're better than we were." That silenced the room. Because now, it wasn't just that the enemy had shown them kindness, it was that the enemy had shown them a better way to be human. And it hurt. It hurt to remember the things they had shouted at prisoners on the Eastern Front. The way they had turned their eyes away from trainloads of men and women who never returned. The way they had laughed at orders they should have questioned. It hurt because there was no punishment now, only reflection. And that was harder to bear. The next morning, a card appeared on the kitchen counter. Drawn in pencil, rough and childlike, was a Christmas tree. Below it, in shaky German, "Danke für das Brot, danke für die Wärme." Thank you for the bread, thank you for the warmth. No one admitted to writing it. But Billy tacked it to the pantry wall, right between ration charts and pie recipes. When the women returned to their barracks, the air felt different. Lighter, sadder, realer. Later that week, one of the Cowboys was reassigned. Before he left, he walked the length of the fence and tipped his hat to the women hanging laundry nearby. They waved back. Small, uncertain waves. But waves nonetheless. It was the first time in the camp that a goodbye had felt like something lost, rather than something escaped. The myth of the American cowboy, cruel, merciless, vengeful, had shattered. In its place stood men who stirred soup, shared bacon, and tipped their hats in peace. But peace, once it touches the heart, does not leave it unchanged. It lingers like the smell of smoke in old clothes. Subtle, persistent, and filled with memory. By mid-December, the snow at Camp McCoy lay thick across the earth, unmoving. The wind no longer howled in rage, but whispered, almost gentle, across the rooftops. Days shortened into gray silence. Nights deepened into dark reflection. Inside Barracks 5, Liesel stood over the small stove, stirring ashes with an iron poker. The heat still came, but weaker now. The firewood was damp. She crouched, fed it slivers of newspaper, and stared into the flickering coals. There was a memory in that flame, one she had buried for months. A train station in 1943. A line of Jewish families. Her own voice, just 20 years old, asking for their names, typing them into a ledger. She hadn't shouted, hadn't beaten. She had obeyed. I was just a clerk, she told herself, again and again. But the fire in the stove didn't care. It burned through lies just as it burned through paper. Across the room, Anka mended a sleeve by lamplight. She glanced at Liesel, then at the ashes. "You're thinking again," she said softly. Liesel didn't answer. "About home?" Anka offered. "No," Liesel whispered. "About what I did before I got here." There was a silence between them, not empty, heavy. Like a snowfall that hasn't yet touched the ground. "I thought I was on the right side," Liesel said finally. "I thought our suffering made us strong. that our orders made us clean. Anka's hands paused on the thread. She didn't speak, but her eyes brimmed. In the weeks since the winterization, since the warm clothes and the hot water, the women had begun to share stories, not proud ones, not heroic. Confessions, not all at once, but in fragments, like broken glass arranged on a table. Marta admitted she had helped burn records at a camp in France. Ilse had watched soldiers slap starving children and had looked away. Even Greta, once the most unyielding among them, now sat by the stove in silence most nights, fingers running along the inside seam of her coat like prayer beads. These were not the stories they had told in training, not the ones written in their files. These were the stories that kept them awake. And now, at last, they were beginning to surface. It wasn't the guards that pulled these truths from them. It was the absence of cruelty. It was kindness that burned. It was mercy that made them ache. Because mercy demanded something that war never had. A mirror. That week, a new rule was announced. The women would be allowed to organize a small Weihnachtsabend, a Christmas Eve gathering. The chaplain would provide candles. The guards would stay distant. They could sing if they wished. There would even be coffee. Coffee. The word alone sparked something almost feral. It had been years. Some of the women wept just hearing it. Others fell silent, stunned. They began to prepare. They crafted decorations from scraps. Stars cut from food tins, garlands made from twisted paper towels and string. Someone painted a pine branch on a bit of cloth using soot and melted wax. They hung it near the stove like a real tree. It wasn't beautiful, but it was theirs. Then came the difficult part. Songs. They couldn't sing the marching songs. Not here, not anymore. Instead, they whispered old carols. The ones their mothers had hummed while baking bread. The ones sung in candlelight, long before the world turned to steel. Stille Nacht. Soft trembling, not a performance, a release. The chaplain brought hymn sheets, blankets, and, as promised, coffee, boiled in battered enamel pots that steamed like salvation. As the sun set on December 24th, the women of Barracks 5 gathered in a circle. Candles flickered. Snow fell outside in a hush. The war, for a moment, felt far away. Not gone, but softened, like smoke rising from a dying flame. The guards did not interrupt. Some watched from a distance, hats in hand, eyes low. One sergeant quietly placed a box of raisins and dried figs near the door. No one took credit. No one needed to. And as the first notes of Leise rieselt der Schnee rose into the rafters, voices cracked. Not from cold, but from memory. Marta's hands trembled as she sang. Greta couldn't finish her verse. Liesel sat with her eyes closed, clutching her coat sleeve as if it anchored her to the ground. When the last note faded, Anke whispered, "My brother would have liked this." "Where was he posted?" Liesel asked. "Stalingrad," Anke said. "He didn't come back." Neither spoke after that, because grief, like truth, doesn't need many words. It only needs room. That night, the ashes in the stove still glowed long after the singing stopped. And in the minds of 37 women, once enemies, now something else, the flames of something new had begun to stir. Not innocence, not absolution, but something more fragile, a beginning. Dawn on Christmas morning arrived without trumpet or pageantry. Only snow, falling in great, soft sheets across Camp McCoy. It blanketed everything in silence. The barbed wire, the watchtowers, the boots left outside doorsteps. It quieted the world like a mother's hand over a fevered brow. Inside Barracks 5, no one spoke. The coals had burned low in the stove. A faint scent of wax still hung in the air from the night before. Liesel was the first to rise. She moved gently, so as not to disturb the others. Even Greta, who normally barked at every creak, lay still, her chest rising in slow rhythm beneath the borrowed wool blanket. Liesel stepped outside into the white stillness. No guards shouted. No dogs barked. The sky was pale as old paper, and the trees stood like sentinels holding up the morning. She pulled her coat tighter and looked toward the main gate. A lone American guard was stationed there, not pacing, not watching, simply standing as if he too had forgotten war for a moment. He saw her, tipped his head slightly. She nodded in return, not enemy to enemy. Just one soul acknowledging another beneath the same snow. Later that morning, a package arrived, square, unmarked, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. The camp translator, Sergeant King, delivered it himself. "For Barracks 5, he said simply. He didn't smile, but his eyes were soft. Inside was a fruitcake, heavy, sweet, American-made. The label was faded, but it still read, "Mailed from Arkansas, October 1944. It must have been rerouted, delayed, forgotten, then handed off by someone who thought, give it to them anyway. There was also a single deck of playing cards, a handful of hard candies, a folded Red Cross postcard with the words, "From strangers who believe in peace." The women stood around the box in silence. No one moved. Then Ilsa, the one who had barely spoken the first month, stepped forward and picked up a peppermint. She held it to her lips, as if kissing the past goodbye, then placed it in her mouth and smiled with tears in her eyes. That afternoon, the camp was still. Snow covered the path so thickly that boots disappeared beneath each step. Even the guards walked slower. Kinder, the women were told they would be granted 1 hour, just one, to walk the interior perimeter under close supervision for fresh air and observation of Christmas protocol. It wasn't much, but it was freedom by another name. They walked in twos, slowly, silently, around the inside edge of the camp. The white landscape stretched out beyond the wire, hills and forest, a frozen lake in the distance, and the blue smoke of unseen chimneys. Somewhere out there, people were waking up beside trees and fires and gifts. Somewhere out there, the world still remembered how to love. But here, in this frozen place built for war, women walked in silence and watched birds rise from pines. Marta spotted them first. 4 starlings, black and quick, fluttering against the wind. "They're staying for the winter," she whispered. Liesel nodded. "They're tougher than they look." Anka, walking a few paces behind, added quietly, "So are we." No one laughed, but no one cried either. The camp dog, a shaggy mutt named Murphy, trailed behind the column. He had been a stray, adopted by the kitchen staff, and wandered freely between the prisoners and the guards. That day, he stopped beside Anki and sat in the snow, panting happily. She reached down and rubbed his ears. Murphy didn't care about flags or language or guilt. He simply wagged his tail and licked her hand. That evening, the barracks smelled of boiled potatoes and faint traces of cinnamon. One of the cooks had slipped them a dash from the officer's pantry, pretending it was a mistake. The women didn't ask questions. They ate slowly, reverently, as if the flavor itself was sacred. After dinner, Ilsa stood by the stove and pulled something from her pocket. It was the Red Cross postcard. She had folded it carefully, again and again, until the edges were soft. Now, she held it up like a scripture. "We may not know who sent this," she said softly, "but I believe them." "What do you mean?" Marta asked. Ilsa looked around the room. At the bent heads, the thin shoulders wrapped in borrowed warmth. The hands that had once signed orders and now held peppermint sticks. "I believe," she said, "that we can become the kind of people they hoped we were when they sent it." The room was still. The snow fell harder outside. tapping gently on the window panes. Liesel stirred the coals. Anka hummed quietly. Greta, who hadn't spoken since the night of the carols, whispered something that no one caught. But she was smiling. For the first time since their capture, none of the women looked over their shoulders before sleeping. None of them clenched their fists. None dreamed of barbed wire. The next day, the work would resume. The war would march on. But something sacred had passed through Camp McCoy that Christmas. Not victory, not forgiveness, but a small, stubborn ember of grace. And like the snow outside, it touched everything. Even the broken places. Winter deepened its grip on Camp McCoy. January arrived not with storms, but with silence, a long hush between winds, like the earth itself was holding its breath. The snow rose higher along the barracks, burying footprints before they dried. Even the crows grew quieter, watching from pine branches like judges who no longer needed to speak. Inside the camp, the rhythm of survival resumed. Work details returned to normal. Chores, kitchen duty, firewood collection. But something invisible had shifted. The women no longer trudged. They walked. They no longer whispered. They spoke. And in their silence, there was now reflection, not fear. Then, one gray morning, something strange happened. A radio was installed in the rec hut near the center of the camp. At first, the German women thought it was only for the guards. News from the front, military dispatches. But that afternoon, as Liesel scrubbed laundry with numb fingers, a soft tune floated out through the open doorway. Piano, not trumpets, not drums, not marches. Piano. The melody was delicate, hesitant, like someone remembering how to speak after years of silence. Liesel froze. She knew that piece. Franz Schubert, Impromptu in G-flat major. She dropped the shirt into the basin and turned toward the building, eyes wide. She wasn't the only one. Anka, Ilse, even Greta had stopped what they were doing. Within moments, a small group had gathered near the door of the rec hut. They didn't cross the threshold. They knew better. But they stood close enough to hear. The song drifted out gently, curling through the cold like breath. It wasn't long. Barely 6 minutes. But when it ended, the silence that followed felt clean, like the world had been washed. No one clapped. No one dared. The next day, more music came. American Swing. Bing Crosby. A broadcast from Chicago, full of static and cheerful voices. The guards listened with casual smiles. But they didn't stop the prisoners from listening too. One sergeant, young, dark-haired, with a southern drawl, stood by the window as the music played and looked at the women clustered outside. He said, without looking at them, "You folks like Schubert, huh?" No one answered. But Liesel met his gaze and gave the smallest nod. He nodded back. That night, back in Barracks 5, the women talked not of food or rumors or letters, but of music. "My mother used to play that piece," whispered Ilse. "Only on Sundays, when the house was clean and the world was quiet." "My father liked Brahms," said Marta, "but only the sad ones." Anka sat near the stove, her hands wrapped around a tin cup. "Schubert wrote that impromptu 2 years before he died," she said quietly. "He was only 31. He knew he was sick. You can hear it in the way the notes fall." The room went still. They weren't prisoners in that moment. They were daughters, students, musicians, people who remembered rooms filled with warmth and sound, people who had once lived, and people who perhaps could live again. 2 days later, something even more unexpected happened. Sergeant King, the translator, arrived at the barracks with a folded sheet of paper and a clipboard. "The camp chaplain," he announced, "is organizing a small concert. For morale, the men will play. But he's asked if any of you would like to contribute." The room froze. Ilse spoke first. "A concert?" King nodded. Just a few pieces. Nothing political, hymns, lullabies, something human. No one moved. Then, from the back, Anka stood. "I played violin," she said, "before the war." King raised an eyebrow. "Do you still?" "I haven't touched one in 4 years." "We can find you one," he said. A pause. Then yes. More silence. Then Ilsa raised a hand. "I can sing?" "Greta?" "Yes," Greta muttered. "I can play piano, if it's not too damaged." By the next week, preparations had begun. The American soldiers cleared the wreck hut, brought in benches, even hung pine boughs on the windowsills. A battered upright piano was dragged in from the chapel storage room. A violin, dented, missing one string, was found in a forgotten supply crate. The guards repaired it themselves. The night of the concert arrived under a full moon. The prisoners sat on one side, the soldiers on the other. No weapons, no orders, just people. The line between uniform and dress had blurred. No one looked quite like the roles they had been cast in. The Americans went first, a guitar trio, a harmonica solo, a funny song about mess hall beans that made both sides chuckle. Then came the German women. Anka stepped forward, violin in hand. She adjusted the pegs, set her feet, and closed her eyes. The first notes were hesitant. Then they soared. A Bach partita, fragile and haunting. Her bow hand trembled, but her heart did not. When she finished, there was no applause. Just silence. Deep and sacred. Then Ilse sang, "Guten Abend, gute Nacht," a lullaby. In that room, full of soldiers and prisoners, some remembered childhood. Others remembered children. By the end of the night, no one had spoken the word enemy once. Not because they'd forgotten the war, but because, for 1 hour, they had remembered something older. Music, like mercy, asks nothing in return, and in that it is holy. January faded into February, and still the snow did not melt. At Camp McCoy, the sun began to linger a little longer each day, but the wind had not yet loosened its grip. It scraped across the windows like a memory trying to be heard. The prisoners wrapped their coats tighter, but inside the barracks, and somewhere deeper still, a different kind of thaw had already begun. After the concert, things did not return to the way they had been. They couldn't. In the rec hall, a new piece of paper had been tacked to the wall. Written in 2 languages, typed neatly with a typewriter, "We have more in common than what divides us. Let music remind us." Camp Chaplain, January 1945. Below it, someone, no one ever admitted who, had pinned a wool glove. Just one. Frayed, patched, but clean. A symbol. A line drawn not in blood, but in warmth. And yet, not everyone was ready. One morning, as the women lined up outside for roll call, a new prisoner arrived. Brunhilde Kranz, tall, sharp-featured, with ice in her stare. She had been transferred from a camp in Georgia after disciplinary incidents. No one asked what that meant. They didn't need to. She walked with her chin high, boots polished, eyes scanning the guards like prey. She wore her old auxiliary cap crooked over her ear and refused to speak unless ordered. To the Americans, she was another POW. To the women, she was a mirror they had long since turned away from. Brunhilde made her opinions clear by the second night. "These Americans are fools," she said loudly in the barracks. "They feed you, clothe you, and you wag your tails like dogs." Ilsa stood from her bunk. "They've treated us better than we treated anyone." "That's weakness," Brunhilde snapped. "That's why Germany will rise again, because we remember who we are." Greta, once the harshest voice among them, looked up slowly. "Then remember this," she said coldly. "I remember starving children. I remember screaming trains. I remember following orders that had no soul in them." Brunhilde sneered. "You've all gone soft." Anka set down her mending. "We've gone human." That word, human, rang like a bell through the room. Brunhilde said nothing more that night. But in the days that followed, her eyes watched every act of kindness with suspicion. She refused the hot soup. She cursed when given gloves. She never once touched the piano. But even she could not stop what had begun, because the line had already been drawn. Not between German and American, not between guard and prisoner, but between those who remembered hatred and those who chose to step beyond it. By mid-February, a Red Cross shipment arrived. In it were supplies for the prisoners: wool yarn, needles, extra fabric scraps. The camp commandant, unsure what to do with them, allowed the women to sew and knit within limits. The women seized it like a lifeline. They began to make things: scarves, mittens, small satchels stitched from flour sacks and old uniforms. Some wrote poetry on scraps of linen. Others embroidered initials into cloth, not of soldiers or nations, but of children. Names they remembered, names they missed. Liesel made a blanket from fabric patches, each square different. One from an old American work shirt, one from her prisoner uniform, one from a flour sack marked "Property of U.S. Army." She stitched it all together like a tapestry of contradictions. It was heavy, uneven, but warm. She named it Versöhnung, reconciliation. One evening, while folding laundry, she offered it to a young American guard who had helped repair their broken window during a storm. His name was Thomas. Barely 20. Freckled. Awkward. He blinked. "Is this for me?" Liesel nodded. "For your next cold night." He hesitated, then took it, cradled it gently, and whispered, "Thank you." He never asked what the word Versöhnung meant. But she saw how he carried it, carefully, reverently, like it held more than warmth. And maybe it did. One night, Brunhilde stood over the stove, silent, watching the others, watching Anke hum as she sewed, watching Ilse stir tea, watching Greta, who now sat with a sketch pad and drew birds she'd seen near the fence. Finally, she asked, almost a whisper, "What are you all doing?" "Trying to remember how to be women again," Anke replied. Brunhilde said nothing, but she did not leave. And when the Red Cross sent a second box a week later, containing one small spool of red ribbon, it was Brunhilde who tied it around a folded satchel and left it silently on the guard's desk. No note, no signature, only red thread wrapped in silence. That was enough, for spring was coming. Not by date, not by calendar, but by signs. The wind softened. The crows returned to the treetops and began to call again. The stove no longer needed feeding through the night. And one morning, the first drip of melting ice was heard from the roof of Barracks 5. A prisoner sat near the door, watching the sun slice through the fog. She didn't smile, but she didn't shiver either. The line had been drawn. Not across borders, not in trenches, but across time. Between the people they had been and the people they still could become. March 1945. The snow was almost gone now, gathered in shrinking mounds beneath the trees like tired ghosts. In its place came the earth again, soft, brown, waking from its long silence. Birds returned first, then the scent of pine sap. Even the wind had changed. It no longer whispered fear, but carried the slow breathing of a world trying to heal. Inside Camp McCoy, the women woke to different mornings, no longer dreading boots outside the door, no longer whispering about beatings or death or rumors of revenge. Instead, they asked small questions. "Will there be butter today? Can I borrow your needle? Did you see the rabbit by the gate?" Their bodies were still thin, their clothes still stitched from hardship. But their voices were alive. On the first morning of March, the guards opened the barrack doors a few minutes late. The sun was already above the trees. Its light poured into the rooms like honey. touching every corner. And in Barracks 5, a moment passed that no one planned, but all of them remembered. Greta, once cold and cruel, had tied back Anka's hair with a red ribbon, the same one Brunhilde had left weeks before. Ilse was humming again. Marta stood near the window, watching a squirrel leap between branches, and Liesel sat beside the stove, her hands folded, the Versöhnung blanket across her lap. She looked at each of the women and said nothing. She didn't need to, because now they were all witnesses, not to war, but to what had survived it. That afternoon, a message came. The war in Europe was turning. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. The German front was breaking. The translator read it quietly to the camp staff. The prisoners weren't told, not officially, but they knew. It was in the soldiers' faces. In the way the flags lowered a little slower that evening. In the silence after mail call, that night, by the stove, the women asked themselves questions none had spoken aloud before. What happens when it ends? Where will we go? What will we tell them? There was no answer. Only the crackle of firewood and the faint sound of boots in the snow outside. 3 days later, something happened that broke the last thread of the world they had known. An American nurse, tall, dark-skinned, with kind eyes and hands like her mother's, arrived at the barracks unannounced. She brought no guards, no clipboard, only a wooden crate filled with soap, salve, and boxes of something wrapped in wax paper. She smiled. "These are for you." Ilse stepped forward. "Why?" The nurse paused, then said softly, "Because the next women who come here might be survivors, not soldiers." A hush fell. "Survivors?" Anke asked. The nurse nodded. "The camps are being found. The real ones." The word real fell like a stone in the room. Real camps, real prisoners, real suffering. Not what they had imagined, not what they had ever been told. Liesel stepped back. "Where?" The nurse opened her mouth and then closed it. She didn't say names, but the look in her eyes said everything. Ovens, rooms, bones. No one wept, not yet. That would come later. But in that moment, the quiet between them was deeper than any grief. Because now they knew. They had not just been misled. They had believed the lie, and they had worn its uniform that night. Liesel tore the last insignia from her prisoner coat, a faded eagle stamped above the left breast. She dropped it into the stove and watched it curl, blacken, vanish into flame. The others did the same. No orders were given. No speeches made, just fire. The next morning, something even stranger occurred. A truck arrived outside the gates. Not for soldiers, but for seeds. It carried gardening tools, packets of peas and onions, rakes, shovels, gloves. The prisoners were told they could help prepare spring beds on the southern edge of camp. "Voluntary," the guard said. All 37 volunteered. The earth was still hard in places, but ready. They bent, dug, worked, some with tears, some with silence, some with a quiet, steady rhythm like prayer. By afternoon, the sun was high. Jackets were unbuttoned, sleeves rolled. And for the first time, the fence, that ever-present border, began to blur. Because just beyond it, the American soldiers were planting too. No rifles, no shouting, just shovels, just men. And between them, that narrow stretch of no man's land, snow melting into mud, felt less like a boundary and more like a bridge. Anke looked up at Liesel and said, "It's strange." "What is?" "I don't feel like a prisoner." Liesel wiped her brow. "Maybe that's because you're not." Ilse, standing a few rows down, added, "Maybe we never were. Not really. Not once we stopped hating." No one replied. But the wind carried their words anyway, over wire, over snow, over silence. That night, the women sat by the fire and didn't talk of Germany, or war, or camps. They talked of children they missed, gardens they would grow, songs they would teach again. And they said nothing of fences, because they had learned something no uniform could ever teach. Not in victory, not in defeat, that sometimes the deepest freedom comes not from escape, but from remembering who you were before the world taught you to hate.